Hi, I'm Will Bruin, and I was just recognized as a Seattle Sounders legend. Now I get to do voice reads for the Sounder at Heart podcast network.
Here we go. Come on! Hey, O'Shan! Let's go!
What a save by Fry! The Seattle Sounders have done it! MLS Cup winners!
Here comes Rui Diaz through the middle to crown it for Seattle! And now they truly can start the celebrations. It's the Sounders MLS Cup.
Nico Ladero leaves absolutely no doubt! The Sounders rule the region! Seattle Sounders is campeón! It's gone! They're gone! Finally!
This feels fucking awesome.
This is a tiny dog.
Nice work on your little yacht thing.
And Portland can't say shit.
You know, what was the thought process in terms of who you decided to use and who you didn't?
Ever since Sounder at Heart wrote a commentary that we didn't take Overcome seriously.
This episode of Nos Arietes is sponsored by Full Pull Wines, a Seattle-based wine retailer and proud sponsor of Nos Arietes since 2011. Full Pull was founded in 2009, is based in Seattle, and is owned and operated by longtime Sounders supporters. They offer the best boutique wines of the world to members of their mailing list, with special focus on their home, the Pacific Northwest. Welcome to another episode of Nos Arietes, part of the Sounder at Heart podcast network, sponsored by Full Pull Wines, our subscribers, and our newest sponsor, Body Spec. We're recording on Wednesday, April 9th, 2025. I am your host, Jeremiah Shan. Joining me today is a friend of the pod, Mark Kastner, and our engineer, Lickett. Aaron is unfortunately out right now. Mark, how is it going?
I wish the Sounders were playing a little bit better, but it's the start of spring. There's no more snow.
Beautiful day there in Minnesota.
It's been a nice few days. Over the weekend, it was 60 degrees. Yeah, I mean, not a whole lot to complain about outside of the Saturday nights I spend watching the Sounders.
Chaos that is the being an American citizen these days, right?
Why? What happened?
So, we're coming off of a week here where the Sounders had one of their worst losses in a bit. It was a pretty good gut punchy kind of loss, and I don't think we're going to spend a lot of time dissecting this loss, but I did want to get some of your broad ideas and thoughts on it, and sort of how that dovetails into the rest of the next few weeks and the season. I went back through today actually, and I wanted to see if my personal recollection was correct, because I saw a fair amount of discussion online about how the biggest thing the Sounders struggled with was San Diego's pressure. And I got to say, I watched the game again. I don't think that was really the issue. I think really what the Sounders' issue is what they did once they broke San Diego's pressure, and how effective San Diego was at sort of turning counter-attacking opportunities into real chances. And so sort of the two polar opposites of this, what the Sounders did poorly, San Diego did well. But I thought, like the Sounders, for instance, I thought the Sounders were very effective in the way that they pressed. They forced a bunch of turnovers from San Diego by forcing them to play out of the back in ways that I don't know that San Diego has had to do a lot. They were oftentimes content to just kick it long. But the problem is that the Sounders just had they got caught sleeping repeatedly on counterattacking opportunities. They got caught sleeping sort of on that first minute free kick or second minute corner kick. Sorry. And it was sort of a theme that Brian Schmetzer hit on yesterday when we talked to him. And he was talking about how the Sounders just didn't show the sort of vision and creativity that he is expecting from them. He took that somewhat on his own shoulders and said, we clearly didn't set them up very well. But Mark, you had some thoughts on that as well, I think.
Yeah, I think right now the thing that's kind of snake biting the Sounders in general is I'm sure Sounders fans will be tired to hear like their underlying numbers are good, even coming out of a San Diego game where they got shellacked by an expansion team. I really do think that like there's a lack of like creativity and bravery in these last, let's say, handful of games that is just sort of like really unbecoming and like untraditional of a Brian Smetzer team. I have seen Brian Smetzer coached Sounders team play really bad before. Of course it's happened. He's been coached for a long time. But one thing that's kind of different, I would say, about this year as opposed to maybe last year or even previous years where they've had slow starts, is just like there's just a lack of like there's nobody like really kind of grabbing this team by the scruff of their neck and like dragging them over the finish line. A, that's one thing. B, another thing is just like the lack of like nobody's making that brave run. Nobody's trying to do something with the ball that is maybe a little bit unorthodox, to just try something, you know? Like there's just everything is just so methodical, so structural, so like, well, this is what the rubric says to do. And there's just not like I don't know if it comes down to like the new formation or the group of players that are playing together. There's just not a lot of like what in my opinion comes down to like bravery on and off the ball from players that have been plenty brave and plenty creative in previous iterations of this team.
Yeah, I think that's a fair criticism. I do think one of the other things that's hurting the Sounders is that their most dynamic players, or some of their most dynamic players, have not been available right now. And by dynamic, I mean, you know, Jordan Morris being able to make those runs in behind repeatedly, and not just making one or two runs, but just sort of consistently stretching the back line. And I think that's, you know, we're seeing bits and pieces of dynamism. You know, we see it from, you know, Jesus Ferreira will attempt a run like that every now and then, but he's not doing it with consistency because he's also happy to sort of peel off and receive passes in half spaces and whatnot. Georgie Munungu is another player who he's capable of making some of those dynamic plays, but he's not going to be your central, you know, he's not going to be your primary playmaker. That's not what they should be relying on him to do. He's more of a supplemental piece. Albert Rusnak is a player who is very good at what he does, but dynamic movements is not really his bread and butter. And, you know, you're missing a Pedro de la Vega is another player who that is his whole deal. His deal is breaking lines with runs and dribbles. And, you know, he's willing to sort of float and be unpredictable. And, you know, I go back to also the start of the season, which was, let's remember that the Sounders started the season pretty well. You know, after the LAFC game, they were averaging basically 2 goals a game and were kind of flying in a lot of ways. And a huge part of that was Paul Arriola and the way he was playing and what he was allowing the Sounders to do as that left wing back. And I don't think Paul Rothrock has necessarily been bad, but he has not been as good as Arriola was. And you sort of take all these incremental steps down. And I think what you're left with is a team that just is not good at these sort of dynamic plays. And that's part of why they've scored 1 goal in their past 4 games, which is obviously not good enough.
Yeah, it's not a recipe of like a championship winning team, however you want to define that. And especially when, typically when the Sounders go through scoring droughts, they don't give up 3 goals. Like,
right.
And the San Jose game was
this
whatever.
Game, they had been okay in that sense.
Yeah. And I think you're kind of bookending a really poor Cruz Azul performance with a really poor San Diego performance.
With you, but yeah, fair enough.
And I think that just like in general, something that I think is lacking in terms of analysis of this team in kind of the, let's say, MLS zeitgeist, so for instance, I'm a real sucker for power rankings. And I was reading Backheel's power rankings and Matt Doyle's power rankings, and there's largely the sentiment that this team will be fine, which they probably will be.
Yeah.
But nobody like realizes that they actually like traveled to Guatemala and Mexico already this season and had to play like, what was it, like 8 games in 14 days or something crazy like that?
It was 8 games in,
hang on.
in 6 games in 18 days, but go ahead.
There we go. Yeah. Sorry.
That's okay.
I'll just chalk that up to dyslexia or whatever. I think, and that's just kind of what happens when an MLS team crashes out of CONCACAF Champions Cup League trophy, whatever they're calling it now. Is it just kind of like there's like I think every MLS fan experiences like a Men in Black like flash memory thing, and they just forget why that happened. But Paul Arriola literally tore his ACL in Mexico, so that happened,
right?
And I just think that like that has some knock-on effects, obviously, when you're kind of like. I think I completely sort of like railroaded the question you actually asked me, but I think that was
I think you answered it.
I think in general, like it's worth trying to win the CONCACAF tournament. I think it's worth putting kind of all of your eggs in that basket to try to win. The flip side of trying to win that tournament is it happens early in the season, injuries can happen, and it happens at a point when certain players' bodies aren't just ready for that workload. That's why Jordan Morris got hurt. Unfortunately, Paul Arriola had kind of a catastrophic injury, and then obviously the minutes and stuff that went into Pedro de la Vega's legs contributed to his injury, as well as the injury Alex Rodon suffered this past weekend and Albert Rusnak. So I'm sure people are tired of talking about or hearing that as sort of an excuse, but I think when you have the combination of players that got hurt when they got hurt, and then to kind of consider everything else at the same time, you end up in a place where the Sounders are going to be kind of boring and sort of ripe for getting shellacked like they did. And that sucks, but I don't know what to do beyond being like, well, I'm glad it's only April.
Yeah. I mean, I think there is an element of glad it's only April, but the other good piece of news is that it does seem like both Jordan Morris and Pedro de la Vega should be back this week. It looks like, I don't want to put too many eggs in the Ryan Kent basket, because as good as I thought he's looked in practice, I don't hope the Sounders are relying on him for too much production for the immediate future. But there is reason to think that some of this should get better in the short term, just because I do think Pedro de la Vega is potentially a real impact player in terms of the way that he's able to affect the way the Sounders play. Jordan Morris, same thing. And so there is, I don't think it shouldn't be too much panic at this point. Of course, if they don't get a result in Dallas, we're going to be right back where we started. But I still look at this team and I still see a roster that I like a lot of these players. I like what they are trying to do. And the numbers tell me that they are doing a lot of the things they need to do in order to win games. It's just that they are losing concentration. Like you said, they are lacking bravery in certain moments. And I don't know if I don't know what the fix for that is, other than to say, do better, which is a really unsatisfying place to be, I think.
Yeah, I think everybody, even people that listen to this that aren't professional athletes, certainly have moments in their job where they're just making stupid mistakes. And maybe you're a member of a team that is just like, there are stupid typos in a presentation, or just like people show like they're everybody knows what it's like to make a mistake. And I think everybody also is acutely familiar with compounding mistakes in one's life. And I think the Sounders are just kind of in a place where like there's screw ups right now. That's just kind of like maybe harsh and unfair, but like that was it the second San Diego goal or the third San Diego goal where it kind of started with the Jackson Reagan turnover?
That was the third one.
Yeah. In that situation, if you were to kind of pause that before Jackson Reagan passed the ball, I think it was more likely that the Sounders were going to score in that situation than San Diego, because they had been playing well. I know San Diego had just scored again, but they had something to build on in that first half, and then he just did that. So it was just kind of like, stop making dumb mistakes.
Yeah, I'll give another example from that game. This was a situation that San Diego didn't actually score from, but I think it was illustrative of the sort of brain fartiness the Sounders were playing with. I don't know if that's a real term. But there was a free kick about 90 yards from goal. And this is another thing that's been a recurring theme this year is I feel like throw-ins and free kicks from deep in the defensive end somehow end up turning into goals against the Sounders. But anyway, I digress. And what happened was there was a free kick and they send it long to Chucky Lozano, who is isolated on Kalani Kosarienzi, who, you could maybe argue Kosarienzi should do better on this situation, but the reality is he's in a one-on-one battle with Lozano on the sideline. Lozano wins the ball, and then he's just free and on goal essentially because no one is paying attention in the central defense. He is essentially behind he's behind everybody at that point, and there's no reason that he should be behind anyone, frankly. And he ends up shooting it over the bar, but it was a good chance. And it's one of those things where it's like, what are we doing here, guys? Why are you allowing Lozano to get behind this way off of a free kick? There's no way in the world that should happen. And it was sort of like that. The whole, all these opportunities, especially at the end of the first half, where it's just like you've got people who aren't quite running back to the positions they need to be in. You've got players that aren't playing sound, positional defense. And I don't know, it was just a cavalcade. Cavalcade? I don't know if that's the right word. But anyway, it was just one mistake after another. Huh?
A cascade of mistakes?
Cascade of mistakes? I think it's cascade of mistakes. There you go. It was just one mistake after another of players not being aware of the situation, of where they needed to be. And it was just a very disappointing performance because this is also the kind of thing we don't normally see from Brian Schmetzer coach teams, where they just are not turned on and they just seem to be totally off their game. And I don't really know what to do about that other than to say, like I said, you guys kind of got to be better at this stuff. And I don't know. I don't enjoy at all that we are sitting here. And I think that the most frustrating thing about all this, and I guess this is where I'll put a cap on this part of it, is, we talked a lot in the preseason. We've talked a lot this season about how deep this team is. And I do think if you go just player by player, this is a deep team. There are a lot of players on this roster who I think can be very useful MLS players. But for whatever reason, they're not quite meshing together right now. And what's even more frustrating about that is that most of these guys were here last year and they were sort of meshing. And so I don't know what it is really about this group that is like, we shouldn't be in the same position we were in last year when there were also a bunch of injuries, but they were different kinds of injuries and they happened in different parts of the season. And they were sort of struggling to play catch up last year. And this year it's just, I don't, like you said, it's the wrong injuries to the wrong players at the wrong time.
Yeah. And I think it certainly opens the door for pretty valid criticism of like how the roster is constructed in terms of like, you're never going to hear me be the type of person that's like, we need a $20 million striker like Atlanta got. I don't really care about like how much money something costs, but what I do care about is like, it is better to move on from certain players a year early than a year late. I think that that's just kind of a good rule of thumb in sports. Like, it is better to move on the year before they kind of fall off their peak than a year after they do. And we saw that with Nico Odero, Raul Ruidiaz, maybe Quinn Dempsey to an extent, although, that was interesting. And it just is kind of a Sounders thing that they maybe hold on to certain players for a little too long for sentimental reasons. And there are now, like, maybe a handful of guys you're looking at that it's like, maybe we shouldn't have kept you around. And for kind of the sole purpose of like a fresh face in that position, doing a different thing, training differently every day, talking differently every day, just being a different person than the guy you've been around for 4 or 5 seasons, that can kind of have an effect on a locker room and kind of revitalize it. Is it probably too early to like call certain players out? Yeah, I agree. But at the same time, like, this time last year, we thought the Sounders needed a complete overhaul. By the end of the season, it was like, oh, maybe they only need a couple of pieces. Well, they went out and got a couple of pieces, good pieces. One of them lasted a month, unfortunately, which is a real shame. I don't want to make light of that situation at all. The other one, I think, is a good player, is going to be a good fit long term, but is being thrusted into a position of like needing to kind of be the it guy on this team, like really, really early into his time here. That's obviously Jesus Ferreira. And now just the vibes they suck. The vibes are really terrible. And that invites all sorts of what I would say are really valid criticisms of how kind of the ownership and the front office has gone about creating this team. That's the flip side of this coin. You get the preseason flowers, you get all the credit in the world for building a deep team, but if that deep team doesn't perform,
right,
you have to take that criticism on the chin of like, maybe we should have like found a different way to get a DP or something in the offseason.
Are there particular players that you feel like are maybe past their sell by date?
I think if you, regardless of the position, but if somebody is 38 years old, still playing, and probably could make at least two better saves in a game, all right. Gloves off, whatever. I haven't been super impressed with Stephen Fry this season. And I am worried about him in general. I think there are, and then just kind of all over the place. I think you can name players like Alex Roldan, Yamar, Nuhu, maybe João Paulo, although he's hardly played this season. And sure, maybe even throw Albert Rusnak into that mix, even though I'm his biggest fan, apparently. You just kind of start thinking like, was this foundation actually there or what? And I think that like, it's really important to point out, I think this is going to be a good team that could potentially compete for MLS Cup this season. But if this just kind of continues to happen throughout May, June into the summer, like, that sucks. Like, the Sounders kind of threw away their 50-year anniversary season. That was kind of a dud. If they throw away their Club World Cup season, which matters to the extent that it is a new thing and they legitimately qualified for it, they're the only team in MLS to legitimately qualify for that. You got to start thinking of in terms of like, you can't hit a home run unless you swing. And I know that the Moneyball like thing is like, get on base. But at a certain point you need a guy or you need something to kind of come in and hit the home run or like hit the double at the very least.
Yeah. I mean, I definitely see your analogy, and I don't, without getting into the particular players that you mentioned, and I'm more inclined to like, I actually think Alex Roldan's been pretty good. I think Rusnak's been pretty good.
I think they've all been fine.
Yeah, I think all of them have been. I think you can, but I think the broader story here is that this was an off season that felt like it needed a big shakeup, and the Sounders opted not to shake things up almost at all, and they effectively brought back every contributor, and they brought in supplemental pieces, players who we weren't sure were even going to be bang on starters, and I think that's a valid approach. I think it's an approach that the Sounders have been taking for the most part since COVID. But you're right. This was probably a year where they could have taken some bigger swings and they opted not to. And the reasons for that are probably multiple, right? On one hand, I'm sure that there was some thinking having continuity was going to be a strength. I'm sure there was some budgetary issues where they just didn't feel like they had the money they needed to go out and make big changes. And and maybe there was some talent identification issues too. I'm honestly not sure. I think the issue is talent identification. I think it's more about budget and sort of more of a collective idea that having continuity was going to be their strength. But we'll see how this plays out. Where we are right now is very frustrating. I share in that very much. And I think it certainly calls into question a lot of the assumptions that, I made about how strong this team was going to be going into this year. And what a lot of people made, what almost every outside observer looked at this team and said, oh, this is a Supporter Shield contender. Obviously, there was a lot of fans who said, no, it's not. It's going to be awful. And, a fair number of those fans have been saying the same thing for several years. And, I guess we'll see who ends up being right here. But I suspect it will probably be somewhere in the middle. I never really thought this was a Supporter Shield contending team because the Sounders never are a Supporter Shield contending team.
I just don't think they're a supporter shield contending club. I don't think
they just don't. This is the Sounders have won the Western Conference, let alone the Supporter Shield one time.
And it was the last time it actually mattered. By the way,
that is true. It was the last time we had on schedule was the year the Sounders won Supporter Shield. They can hang that banner, right?
And I'm not just saying that because that happened to be my wedding day. I'm saying that because that's back when MLS you actually played the Eastern Conference and
I did
all that
home and away and everything.
I don't want the last point I want to make is I don't want somebody to clip the show or God forbid jump into my mentions or anything being well, you're the type of guy that kind of always believes in the team. I do think this is a good team. I do think Pedro de la Vega is that playmaker and that sort of difference maker. And I do think in the long run this season, they're going to finish between, let's say, first and fourth in the West, and they'll probably be playing in the Western Conference Final. That's sort of the expectation I have for this team. And I think that that's a really good season. However, I do want to be sympathetic to this. You need something to excite this fan base. And I think that goes beyond just winning a couple of games when it matters most, because I went to my first Sounders home game in 2 years a few weeks ago. It was the which game? It was the Houston game. Very boring game to go to.
Good game to go to. Gosh.
Yeah, and I'm not trying to draw too many conclusions from just being at that game, but it was incredibly stark, the difference between the last home game I went to, which also happened to be a very boring 1-0 win against Dallas, and this 0-0 draw against Houston. And there's just not an excitement in the stadium anymore. And I don't think one signing does that. I don't think lowering ticket prices probably helps, but I don't think there's one solve for this thing. But the easiest way to make fans excited is to spend a lot of money on one player. So it's an idea, Craig. If you want to give me a call, I got some ideas. Adrian, you probably have my number. if you need me to consult on some ideas, let me know. Just throwing that out there.
Yeah, very, very, very big of you to do that. Well, I think that's probably a good place to take a break. We're going to come back and we're going to talk about, we're going to do our power rankings feature that is now a weekly thing. This week, we're going to be ranking, what do we call this? Ranking the things that are to blame for the Sounders start. And you came up with a pretty good list that we'll work off of. So we'll go from there. But yeah, you're listening to No Audiatis, and we'll be right back. Ready to kickstart your fitness journey? Whether you're an athlete, a fitness enthusiast, or just getting back into shape, BodySpec has you covered. For less than the price of a haircut, you can access DEXA scans, the world's most accurate body composition scan. Right now, we're offering an exclusive $10 discount on single scans, which brings the price down to $50. Just visit the site bodyspec.com/sounder@heart and use the code SOUNDER at checkout. The scans only take about 10 minutes and you get results in less than an hour. This is the same type of technology that top athletes around the world use to keep track of things like muscle mass and bone density. These types of scans traditionally cost more than twice as much. Although there are brick and mortar locations around the Puget Sound, they also have mobile facilities that visit gyms across the region. Just visit bodyspec.com/sounder@heart to get more information.
Thank you for listening to the Sounder at Heart podcast network, which now includes Nos Audiates, Lobbing Scorchers, and the Cooler Guild. We've been independent since August of 2023, but need your support to make sure it continues. Although this podcast is free, it's only made possible by your continued support. Memberships start as low as $25 a year, which not only helps make podcasts like this one happen, but also gets you access to everything we produce. If you're able to support us at higher levels, starting at $75 a year, you gain access to a host of other perks, most notably entry into our members-only Discord, where the smartest, funniest, and most engaged commenters share their thoughts and ideas. To find out more, just visit sounder@heart.com and click the subscribe button in the top right corner. Thanks for listening.
Nos Audiatis, admittedly, is not exactly known for our spicy takes, but that doesn't mean we want our food to be mild. Spice up your life with Haxon Ferments. Handcrafted in Georgetown and made with the best local ingredients from across the Pacific Northwest, they specialize in unique small batch fermented hot sauces and vinegars. Haxon Ferments brings bold flavors and natural fermentation together for something truly special. Whether you're a heat seeker or just looking to elevate your cooking, you'll find something you love at haxonferments.com. That's HAXANFERMENTS.com. And right now, if you use the code SOUNDER@heart, that's all one word, at checkout, you will get a free hot sauce with your order. Again, go to haxonferments.com, use the code SOUNDER@heart at checkout for a free hot sauce with your order. Haxon Ferments is a proud sponsor of the Sounder at Heart podcast network. Welcome back to Nos Audiatis. So we are going to close out today's episode with a feature that we call Power Rankings. And if you haven't heard us do this before, here's a little reminder. Basically, we come up with a subject. We pick 5 things to rank in that subject, and then we talk about them. So Mark actually came up with these 5. I came up with the subject, which was why are the sound? What would we blame the Sounders start on? Mark picked the 5 things, and I'm going to go through and I'm going to rank them myself, and then we can kind of discuss them. So we're going to start at number 5. Number 5, you had fixture congestion, which I think is an interesting idea to bring up because we're now 3 weeks. The Sounders haven't had much fixture congestion for the last few weeks. But you still think that there is a legitimate reason why this is impacting their start.
Yeah, and I think the reason why that is the case is that there's sort of like a delayed, there can be a delayed effect of what can happen in fixture congestion.
Yeah.
Sort of like a delayed effect to like how I can talk, apparently. So there's a lot of research sort of like within the world of soccer that like the amount of minutes in a player's legs matters. Like everybody sort of has their like level. And we're probably going to talk about another sort of issue that I think has been caused from like the Sounders playing a lot of midweek games early in the season. But I think basically the reason why this matters is that the Sounders had a lot of adrenaline to get through CCL or CCC or whatever it's called, and then they kind of crashed out.
CONCACAF.
And there's a lingering effect to those matches, and I think one of the lingering effects is like maybe something that went wrong when they were playing Cruz Azul is stuck in their head, or maybe they're just still sort of like not fully. I mean, they should be fully fit. It's almost mid-April now, but like playing that many minutes that early in a season can have some lingering effects. So I would have probably ranked that number 5 myself. So good start, I'd say.
Okay. Yeah, I agree. I think that there is some impact there, and I think if you look around the league at the teams that are off to kind of rough starts, LAFC also is off to a rough start. Not as rough as the Sounders, but they do have 4 losses in 7 games.
Which is more losses than the Sounders have.
Which is actually more than the Sounders have, exactly. LA Galaxy are off to a very, very, very bad start. I don't know if it's necessarily fixture congestion that's doing them in, but they're off to a very bad start. RSL is off to a bad start. So it's, you can kind of go down the list, and there are some outliers. Vancouver Whitecaps that are definitely doing quite well.
They're probably the best team in the world.
They might be the best team in the world. Columbus Crew also undefeated, off to a solid start. Again, that's a good team. Count. Yeah. Cincinnati is more middling. They've gotten some wins, but they aren't necessarily playing quite up to what they were expecting. And this is I think there's some evidence for what you're saying is what I'm saying.
Cincinnati's also in Ohio, technically, even though their airport is in Kentucky.
Is that true? That's interesting.
Yeah.
Do they use the Louisville airport?
No, it's just on the other side of the border.
Oh, interesting.
I think it's weird place, man.
It is a weird place. So, all right. Well, let's. Yeah, I think we're good on that. So, number 4 on what I'm putting number 4 on your list is harsh end variance, and I want you to explain what harsh end variance is for our listeners.
I think they are on the harsh end of variance. I think there are several. If you do the thing where you play out each of the games that they played 100 times,
mm-hmm.
I think they're in the lower percentile of outcomes in a lot of those games. I don't know if I think San Diego is or isn't a perfect example of this. So I'm just going to kind of put it on the other side. But I think, for instance, like the Houston or the Charlotte game, or maybe even the San Jose game, definitely the first leg of the Cruz Azul game, I think that the Sounders have largely played pretty well. And I think that the sort of underlying numbers support that. And the thing about underlying numbers early in a season is there's just a lot of noise in the data, and time will tell if that's actually true or not. And I do think that if you kind of look at some of the stuff that's happened, it's probably, outside of like dumb mistakes, probably unfair. They probably could have picked up at least 2 more wins. And
2 or 3 maybe even.
Yeah, and then then the vibes don't suck as bad or at all. The vibes probably don't suck at all if they have 2 or 3 more wins. So I think that, and the main point I have about the variance thing is MLS is a salary capped league. There's so much controlled spending in this league, and that's where variance is going to sort of like spread like a epidemic, where like you're going to have some really good teams that are just going to be bad for no reason. And you're going to have maybe some bad teams that way overperform just because the environment is so controlled, where in other leagues around the world, that doesn't happen as much.
Yeah. So to give some more data to your point, the Sounders are on 6 points through 7 games. According to American Soccer Analysis expected points, which basically looks at each game and tells you what they would assume you should get out of it, the Sounders should be on 10 or 11 points, which I do think would be that's at least another win, if not potentially 2 more wins. And I think if you can look at their XG performance for the most part, they probably should have at least 1 or 2 more wins. They definitely should have won the Charlotte game. They probably should have won the Houston game, and they probably should have won the San Jose game. And if you give the Sounders 3 more wins, that's 5. I mean, that's 5. Well, that's 6 more points. It's a very different conversation we're having. That would be sitting on 12 points. So
three more wins is actually 9 more points. So
no, 3 more wins, but they got single points in all 3 of those.
Oh, you're right. Yeah. 2 times 3 is 6. Yeah. You're very right. Yeah.
Yeah. We're having a math off here. All right.
Yeah. What happens when you have two writers do math together?
Right. Exactly. All right. So number 3, lack of imagination. And this is more, you said, more of a broader criticism of the coach, the formation, the selection. And yeah, I think that's what you're basically saying is the Sounders could have been doing more tactically to improve their results.
Yeah. And I think what I kind of meant by that point was something I talked about earlier in the show in terms of like their lack of bravery and their sort of like really off-ball runs. I thought Brian Smetzer said something really interesting in his kind of media availability yesterday, which I watched on YouTube, where he sort of identified the problem as like a lack of vision by certain players off of the ball with the runs that they make. And I think he singled out Paul Rothrock in particular. I don't know if I would like totally say this is like individual players or what, but I think there's just a broader sense around this team right now of like that just extra 0.5% or that extra little thing to do to make that run or make that movement or try that pass just isn't there right now. I think that's because, like we talked about earlier, the lack of dynamic players on the field. I think there is sort of a commitment to a particular play style that probably doesn't fit the players that are available right now. And yeah, there's a lot of chatter about the formation and whether that should change or what. But this formation looks a little different, but it really just isn't that different than how they played last year. And the social media team tweeted out a different combination of numbers on a formation graphic. If you're going to play Nuhu, this is how Nuhu should play. He shouldn't be an overlapping left back. He should be this type of player. Or
right. And
Christian.
I agree with you there. I think that to me, the conversation around the formation is maybe a little missing the mark, because it feels like they're ultimately building out basically this in a similar way. Although the idea here, and this is where I think it's interesting, is the idea here this year was that they were going to be able to commit an extra number forward. And I do wonder if that number is catching them on the back end. They're maybe a little bit more prone to giving up counterattacks, and they seem like this year that's been biting them. But I don't think they can afford to do less offensively than they're doing now. That's sort of one they're just going to have to figure out.
I don't actually think it's biting them on the back end. I do think it's biting them in the midfield.
Okay. Yeah, fair enough. All right. So number 2, simply the lack of a Morris alternative at striker. And I think that this is really interesting, because I think this was the thing that most people identified as being the biggest need this offseason. It was also the thing that the Sounders seemingly addressed, and it has not worked out.
Yeah, I think that in this formation, Jesus Ferreira is a terrible alternative, at least at this point in the season, to what Jordan Morris offered. They're completely different players. I think that the criticism of Jesus Ferreira's first half against San Jose warranted, but reached a tipping point for me where I thought it was like just harsh and certain people were just kind of downright mean about it. Especially with how he played in the second half and how that game ended up just being sort of fine. If you get a point away to San Jose, you're in a vacuum. You'll kind of just take that at any point in the season. But it's about what Jordan Morris does. And something that sticks out in particular is something Matt Doyle said on this podcast early in the season.
Ooh.
Just I think you asked him a question about like, is Jordan Morris worth a DB contract or whatever?
Yeah.
And
I do vaguely remember this.
Matt Doyle said something that I really appreciate. It put words to something that I've like felt for several years now watching Jordan Morris play. Jordan Morris is a type of player that has gravitas around him. He attracts gravity. Like there's a lot of gravity around Jordan Morris. Even when he's not playing well, he occupies defenders. The defense or just sort of a team in general needs to know where Jordan Morris is at all times. And that's just the type of player he is. He is a different type of striker to Raul Ruiz. He is a different type of striker to a lot of the strikers in MLS, actually. And I think that that's why it's really hard to quantify his contract. However, one thing he does is he will make a run that opens up so much space for the rest of the team. And even if he doesn't get the ball, and there's just nobody that does that right now. Danny Musovski probably does it to like a 40% level, which is why I think the Sounders have looked really good when Danny Musovski plays, is because like he does that stuff.
Right. It's
Georgie
a less,
Mungo
it's like,
is not that player.
It is funny because Musovski is, I think, catches the ire of a lot of Sounders fans because he's not scoring. Right. And I think it's a fair thing to want your backup striker to do, is to score when he gets those opportunities. And even in this game against San Diego, he had a couple decent looks and he didn't convert. And so this is sort of an ongoing concern. But what he does do well is he does mimic. He is sort of like a poor man's version of Jordan Morris. And that's kind of what you want. You want someone that's going to play in the same style, even if he's not going to be as good. This is MLS. It's not realistic to think that you're going to have backups that are just as good as your starters at every position. But I can't help but wonder if this game against San Diego goes a little bit differently if Musovski was fully fit to be able to play in it. And, it's, I don't know. It's probably not worth getting into that particular debate, but I do think Musovski potentially is a good Jordan Morris backup. But what we're learning is that Ferreira is the Sounders just have to play differently if Ferreira is going to be the 9. They haven't had a lot of time with him at the 9, admittedly, and it doesn't look like they, so I don't know. We'll see. We'll see how this goes. My suspicion is that Ferreira is going to start at at one of the 2-10 spots. I think we're going to see the 3-4-2-1 again, but it looks like Morris might be able to start. So that would be good. And I think that will, put this particular element to test for sure. But number one, I think it's hard to escape that injuries to the right players or the wrong players at the wrong time. You said the right player. I don't know how you want to say it, but the injuries are impossible. It's not that you can look at any one of these injuries and say this should not have been this big of a deal. But you look at sort of like what we talked about earlier in the show. You look at all the injuries that happened, and you look at who they happened to, and you look at when they all happened at once. Hard to escape that's still feels like the number one culprit here.
Yeah, I think this team was, I think if you had like a really honest Craig Weibel and Brian Spencer in the offseason, I think they would have both said, like, there's going to be a stretch of games where Pedro de la Vega is injured. There's going to be a stretch of games where Jordan Morris is injured. Maybe somebody on the team tears his ACL. Maybe that's Paul Arriola. I don't think even in their sort of like worst imaginations, they would have said all of that's going to happen in the same
2
week.
weeks. No, not in 2 weeks. And sorry, in the span of 4 days.
Yeah. All of that's going to happen between a Tuesday and a Sunday. And really, the only person that I can think of that had a worse week than that, I'm not going to make that joke. Never mind. I was trying to shoe in a youth pastor joke, but I couldn't get there. I just think like the timing of those 3 injuries, how they happened, when they happened, the fact that they got knocked out of the CONCACAF thing, it all just kind of sucked. And I think that the Sounders would be like, okay, so for instance, we just talked about kind of Jesus Ferreira being a stand-in for Jordan Morris. I think if Jesus Ferreira is playing at the number 9 and Pedro de la Vega is playing on that kind of right side 10, I think that works, especially because if Albert Rusnak's on that other sort of like half space, I think that combination of players works. And I think especially if there's sort of like some dynamism happening like on the wings from the wingbacks, I think that combination works. I think if Jesus Ferreira and Jordan Morris are able to play together in kind of Morris at the 9, Ferreira either kind of underneath him as a second striker or in one of kind of these number 10 things, I think that works. But the fact that in particular, both Jordan Morris and Pedro de la Vega got hurt at the same time just is the like, just knocks the wind out of you in the way of like, if you crash your bike really bad when you're a kid, you're going to be fine long term, but it just like is such a shock to the system in that like moment that it makes sense that they've just lacked a sort of like dynamic attack since that happened.
Yeah, I would agree with all that. I think the other thing is, it's funny because I feel like the conversation around Pedro was starting to change because he was playing well. But now we're going back to like just looking at his MLS numbers, and he hasn't scored in MLS, but he, and so we're kind of back to like, this guy is kind of a bust. I'm bullish. I'm just going to put it out here. I'm bullish on Pedro de la Vega. If he stays healthy, which is admittedly a big if, I think he's going to produce. I think he looked great in CONCACAF Champions Cup. Admittedly, they were goals against, maybe not the best opponent, but he's just showing some level of dynamism that we haven't seen from him before, that the Sounders don't really have otherwise. And, I'm hopeful that if he's fully, and I thought he looked good against San Diego. He brought some energy. He, granted, this is a team, he wasn't playing against a team who was playing the Sounders straight up at that point, but I was encouraged by what I saw. I'm not ready to throw in the towel on this. I'm not ready to admit eat all the crow everyone, the detractors would like us to eat, I suppose. I still think this is there's a way forward here, but I will also say that I'm not going to be here next week to answer for any of this. You and Aaron are going to be doing the show next week. I am going to Mexico to visit my wife and I and kids are going to go to Mexico and visiting family there. So hopefully that goes well. Hopefully I come back and the mood is improved and everyone is excited. And if not, I guess that's how it goes.
I think
so thanks for filling in, Mark.
Yeah, I think if the Sounders win while you're in Mexico,
I'm going to have to stay again. Yeah, that's what happened last time I went to Mexico. Or no, I went to Hawaii. Sorry, that was when I was going to Hawaii. But yeah,
you just go when you go on vacation, and they played pretty well against Pumas when you went to the game there, right?
They did, yeah, they did.
Yeah,
so it's a good point. I might have to keep going to Mexico.
I don't. Yeah, I mean, maybe we need a few more subscribers for that to happen. But just an idea, when things are going wrong, you got to think outside of the box. And I'm thinking maybe
these are the sacrifices I'm willing to make.
Yeah. So.
All right. Well, Mark, thanks again for filling in for Aaron. Thanks for filling ahead of time. Thanks for filling in next week. A little bit more housekeeping. I'm going to be doing a show with Nico later in the week, so I guess you will hear from me again. I will also be doing a podcast. I did an interview with Wade Weber to sort of preview the Open Cup game on Tuesday. So that'll be another. So you're going to hear from me. I'm not going to be here to talk about the game on Saturday, is all I'm saying. But anyway, thank you to our sponsors, Full Pool Wines, Body Spec, Haxon Ferments as well. I am Jeremiah Oshan, signing off for Mark Kastner and Lickett. This is No Study at This. And remember, you'll never get alone.
I expect a LAFC who's motivated to prove themselves at home, to prove to their fans that they're capable of winning in this league. And it's up to us to really brew in the party. You guys like that? No? Awkward joke, dad joke right there, huh?